Welcome back to Leadership is Like a Box of Chocolates. I'm Rose Martin, the coordinator on the downtown campus for Student Orgs and Leadership. I'm joined with
Chris Watts, the coordinator on the Tempe campus for student organizations and leadership.
Thanks for following along with us. Or if it's your first time tuning into one of our little videos here, we are just kind of discussing leadership skills and traits for our student leaders and for all students around campus. Today, we're going to be talking about what is your legacy, kind of going over the impact you've made as a student leader and the impact that you can leave going forward.
Absolutely. I say let's dive right on into it. When we talk about legacy, there's so much that goes into that. But the biggest thing about legacy is it focuses on that impact you have when you, the person, are no longer there. So when you're thinking about your legacy, you're really this is really a very forward thinking kind of way to look at leadership. It's focused on the future more so than the right now.
Right. I'm kind of focusing on more looking at things, traditions, stuff that's set up to keep going rather than achievements that you did in this year. Those things might be nice for achievements and for good goals and things that you've accomplished, but they're not setting up the legacy for the future.
Mhm. And that's the big thing is, like you said, having that big year isn't a bad thing. And I want to clarify this idea of legacy and the here and right now are not mutually exclusive, but they definitely need to complement each other. Because it's one thing to have that really good year where everybody's going to remember, from your generation of students is going to remember your name, but that's very different from being back thinking, 5, 10, 30 years down the road, and you could say, this thing that everybody's involved in on campus, I was a part of the start. I started that. That's a very different view, vision, and way of being remembered for that matter.
Right. And I think a lot of that can come to for our student leaders out there is really just like having that thought of what am I doing right now that will leave a lasting impact for the next couple of years following me and even further down the road. Not what am I getting done that's going to have an impact today, but what is going to have an impact in the future, whether that's starting a new regular event or onboarding a new people that follow the student organization's goals and are going to keep it moving forward, or just having an impact in the community here at ASU and through the Phoenix metro area, finding different ways to grow your organization as a whole rather than just what you've done as a leader.
Absolutely. Like growing the organization, I think, is a beautiful part. And you touched on a really important one in there, the idea of that, how are you preparing the leaders of tomorrow? What are your thoughts on kind of that role, thinking about this from a student org's perspective, tying that officer transition into legacy?
Yeah, I would say from what I've seen in my time as a coordinator in the last little bit is that like most successful student organizations aren't the ones that have the best president like currently or the best leader, the best officer one. It's the one that has a good officer one or a great officer one that sets up the even better incoming officer one. Someone that can leave the organization in good hands is a more successful organization than someone who just had a really good spike year and then the organization goes away the next year.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Like having that super charismatic person who can draw in a lot of people one year is great, but that doesn't take you anywhere. So thinking of that idea of the officer transition, the officer change, what for to leave a good legacy, what does that look like? What's involved in that?
From what I would say, what I suggest to our student leaders a lot is delegation coming earlier in the semester, but especially now towards the end of the year is really making sure that your incoming people know what needs to be done, timelines, have an idea of what some goals should be, what are things you've done in the past, what could maybe be changed, giving them the keys to success so they're not coming into the new year feeling like they have to figure everything out and then they can start making progress, just having them set up for success right away. That way that the new semester can just get off and running. Because I've noticed that some of our better student organizations this year were the ones that were able to start doing events in August, like right when the semester started, or even in early September. They didn't have to spend that first month and a half learning processes, learning how to submit everything, basically figuring out how to run a student organization, because that is something their previous leader already taught them.
Oh yeah, you're right. It starts at the beginning right there because that August is such an important time, especially on the college campus. August is a huge recruitment time period. Everybody's new, or everybody's got new goals and that sort of thing. So it's a great time to draw new folks in. And I think you hit on another really important word there when it comes to building a legacy, that delegation idea. Because delegation is not only is it about training somebody else, but it's about showing trust. And as a leader, that show of trust allows other members to come to recognize that person as capable. And if we're being honest, if you're building an organization where you don't trust the delegation of something to someone else, are you building an organization or are you building a monument to your own abilities? You know,
Right. I think it was one of our previous videos. We actually talked about one of the key factors for a good student leader is empowering others. And that I think what you were just speaking on is actually a good point, because if someone is not delegating and if your student organization is pretty just ran by the top and overall, you could almost argue that that's just a group project versus a student organization. It's more just two of you putting something together for the community rather than an entire organization creating a tradition at ASU or something new, an event that they're going to do year after year. That comes from trusting and delegating to the other people in your organization.
absolutely. So we've got trust and delegation are two important aspects of transitions to leave a good legacy. Honestly, I say this, having gone through this a few times myself, I think people are not necessarily fans of things like transition documents or transition notebooks and stuff like that, but they can be invaluable, especially if you've got these things that lay out every little detail, every little password or process. And the process doesn't just say, send this email. It says, click on this to do this, click on this to do this. It's draining and it's difficult, but the difference something like that can make is monumental.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, even when you're starting a new job, if someone has left you one of those, it just makes everything so much easier. It is, I can understand where it's tedious to create it, but it's so helpful. And doing that for your student leader for the next one up, for the person behind you, they're going to appreciate that so much. I mean, you're basically just giving them the tools to success. And then hopefully they can take that, add to it, and then just keep passing it along. I mean, you don't want it eventually to get to this thick book, but you know what I'm saying? Like, keep updating it.
Right, right. Absolutely. Okay, so good transitions, delegation, trust.
Exactly.
Is there what else do you feel like falls into that? Focusing us back on this idea of creating your lasting legacy.
Yeah, I think a good way to create your lasting legacy, if you feel like, I'm going to speak now to the student organizations that maybe you, because we're coming to the end of the year, maybe you didn't have a crazy big event or something that you're like, wow, that's going to be a tradition. Now I think it comes back to focusing on who have you brought into the organization, or how has the organization grown? Like, who are the current members that are going to be sticking around, and just really focusing on those members and asking them what do they need for success for the following year. That can be a
Sure.
good tip for student leaders to kind of ask them, be like, hey, I'm on my way out. What do you need?
And so how it's, yeah, like you said, it's about empowering them to step into those roles, giving them the tools. But that kind of raises another interesting question, because it's not always the case where the student leader is immediately gone from the organization. There are cases where the student leader is sticking around, or even a case where you've got two very popular candidates running for a role and one of them loses. So you still got that big presence, that big personality there who has been recognized as a leader. So kind of two sides to this coin. One, as the person who is looking to create that lasting legacy, how do you handle that situation? Say you're the one stepping into the president role to create the lasting legacy, or even the one stepping out of the president role. I use the phrase president, but like the leadership role to create that lasting legacy.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way. If you're the one stepping in, I think it's good to show early on that you want to, that you're, the best way to say it is like you're open to change. I think when people come in and they're just like, oh, we're going to stick to, this is exactly how we've done it, we're going to do it the same way, it's not the best for a growing organization. So just being willing to open to change. And then, like we were talking about earlier, if you're not the one, let's say you did run and you didn't get the position, that doesn't mean you can't still be a leader in the organization. We talk about a lot of different ways through this series, if you guys have watched along, of other ways you can make an impact without being the student leader of the organization. And a lot of that's just by like showing up, being diligent, being willing to put in the extra work, and showing a lot of it by through example or through encouragement of others is a good way you can show and be a leader without having to be the one with that title of I'm the head leader of this organization.
Oh, absolutely. And it's sometimes it's almost like that is a bigger test of your skills as a leader, to be able to be willing to admit, this person won, how can I still be an asset to this organization? And then sometimes we phrase this conversation as your legacy, but you almost have to extrapolate that a little more to, rather than your individual legacy, it's really about what is the organization's legacy. Am I going to be known as the person who brought it down crashing and burning? Hopefully not. Or am I going to be known as, the best alumni member they've had or whatever?
Yeah.
It's kind of acknowledging that space. Like you can be disappointed. Absolutely. There is nothing wrong with being disappointed in not getting a role you wanted. But if you let that stand in the way of the organization, that's a very different legacy.
Agreed. And that's, I think, a good thing for everyone to remember is, even if you didn't get the position you were going for and you're not, and someone else, maybe it was contentious, I don't know. You guys both still joined, or you joined the same organization for a reason. There's a reason you're in that organization, is because you like the work you do. So just because you didn't get the position you wanted doesn't mean you should then not do the work for that organization. Like the goal shouldn't be you yourself as the person of like, oh, I needed to be the one with my face on the posters, everything like that. The goal should be, oh, I want to make our organization the best organization. I want to win student organization of the year at the Pitchfork Awards. That's what I want to help happen. And if I have to do that as the vice or as second or as just a helper on the team, that's what I'm going to do.
Absolutely. And that can be a tricky thing, I mean, especially depending on the size of the organization. Let's be honest, if you are excited and thrilled to step up to a leadership role, a formal leadership role, there is a certain element. I'm going to use the phrase ego, which is typically a negative connotation. You have pride in yourself, and that's wonderful. Like that allows you to be passionate and experience things that you need to. It's when that ego gets in the way of communication and working together and developing plans and goals and vision. That's when it becomes an issue, because then again, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, rather than it being an organization and a team effort, it becomes all about the individual. And when it's all about the individual, it doesn't necessarily paint the group's vision, obviously.
And that's a great point for everyone. It's just, when you're talking about, I mean, then it's the title of this series of this episode is, what is your legacy? Your legacy doesn't necessarily, like Chris was saying earlier, it doesn't have to mean you as a person. It can be you as a student organization.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a great one. I would like to go into a little bit of talking about like the ways we can help currently right now with the re-registration process to our new officers, because that is something that's going on right now in the month of April as we head into summer, and kind of giving them the tips for the summer. Like, what do you believe are the best things that our student leaders now that are maybe on the way out or just stepping down from their role can give to the incoming leaders prior to the summer?
A big thing, and obviously this does depend a little for everyone, but if you take the approach of just, I'm no longer the president, I'm washing my hands and walking away, again, that, I'm not saying you have to be at the beck and call of the new president, but that leaves little opportunity for further development. It's another chance, again, as a leader, for you to continue developing your own skills, looking at kind of that mentorship role. So I don't think the right approach is to just wash your hands. That said, you also don't want to be doing everything. Looking at it from our own perspective, for us, I think it's important that you go ahead and get the officers transitioned on Sun Devil Sync, because that's going to make sure the new officer is getting the right information about registration. You want to make sure that you're forwarding along information that needs to be passed along. Does your organization have a bank account? Does it have other sort of documentation or materials that need to be passed along so that people still have access to it? How do you do that? How do you share that information? I think those are kind of important starting points. And also to make sure the person's comfortable with, looking at it in the summer. Let's be honest, college students in the summer typically have other things they're focused on. They're not going to be responding to a bunch of emails for events and activities necessarily, or for your organization. They might, but that's not the common practice, let's say. So what does that plan look like? Are you reaching out and setting up, is your new officer, your new leader setting up a plan now for what the fall needs to look like and letting folks know? Are they using the summer to plan and do something else? Is the spring your busy time, so you're really kind of using this time to recover? What is the focus, right? Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think, you touched on a couple really key things, and one that really right away I hit was the documentation. Like, we do run in, as I'm sure both of us have dealt with, of student organizations that are like, we have a bank account and I don't have the password to it or the routing number. And I'm like, well, that's like tough because we aren't affiliated with the bank account. So that's just something that your student, like, it's the responsibility of one leader to pass on to the next leader. And those kind of things are just really good to iron out. Another thing I'd suggest is, if you have had a moment during the year that you're like, wow, that was difficult, like those 2 weeks were very tough, those should be something you tell the incoming leader, like, hey, I had a really hard time getting my first submission in for funding. Here's what I struggle with and how I would suggest getting around it. Because eventually, if you're at this point, you figured it out, you got past it. So when you look back on it, maybe help prevent it from happening again the next year.
Oh, absolutely. Because there's so much of that. And honestly, circling all the way back to where we started this conversation, your legacy, that's something you should be doing throughout the whole year. Don't just, everybody notes things differently. Personally, I like to keep a list. And if something pops up, I'll pull up the list and mark it down, because then when you get to the end, you've got that whole list. And that's whether it's the big things like, here's what I really struggled with on this funding request, or the little things. You know what? I forgot to send the email reminder on the third meeting of the month or the third meeting of the semester for X, Y, or Z reasons, because X, yada, yada, yada. Taking those sort of things, take the big, the little, everything in between, and use that as a chance to encourage the next person. They may face different challenges, but are you making sure that they don't face the same challenges you did?
And I think the final thing I would say for leaving your legacy is just being, like you spoke on it earlier, but being willing to help them and talk to them and give future advice, or even just a future shout out. If you see the club doing well and you're like, you're an alumni, you can always send the club an email and be like, nice job, or comment on their Instagram post, be like, wow, this looks great. Just little things like that to show that alumni interaction helps show that it has a lasting impact here at ASU.
Absolutely. That said, I think you're absolutely right. Alumni interaction, appreciation can be important, but you also don't want to overdo it. You had your time as a student leader. Let the new student leaders be the student leader.
You shouldn't be planning there.
Exactly. You can be appreciative without running the event for them, right?
Exactly. Yeah. No, this should be all of like reflection of like, wow, this looks great. Not here's what I would do, or here's how you should change what you're doing.
Absolutely.
It's, again, you had your time, and it's now the time to let the next generation take over.
So, any closing thoughts on about your legacy?
No, good job to all our student leaders this year. And thank you all for joining us for this series so far.